Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us virtually. Not so long ago, AGBU, the world's largest nonprofit Armenian organization, started supporting the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact in Lebanon with respect to human rights, education, environment, and anti-corruption. Our commitment defined our willingness to strengthen our ties and to engage with the Lebanese and international institutions. Since then, strengthening our partnerships, working towards the sustainable development goals, and engaging our own youth in rebuilding a cohesive, diverse Lebanese society has been our top priority. Having a vital mission towards our community, and with a history and track record spanning 116 years, AGBU will continue to play an integral part in nurturing and developing the Lebanese society. Today, on the occasion of the International Women's Day, the AGBU Lebanon and the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University jointly organized this multi-panel symposium. We want to address the environment as a basic human right, the relationship between climate change and gender equality and women's rights, the impact of climate change on women and girls in the region, the importance of including women in climate decision-making, and strengthening intergenerational dialogue and partnership on gender equality and climate change. Today's panelists will shed light on the tremendous efforts by women in Lebanon, the region, and around the world in shaping a more gender-balanced and climate-inclusive world. And now, I would like to welcome our inspirational co-organizer, Dr. Miriam Sfer, the director of the Arab Institute of Women, to deliver her opening remarks and then start the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. I'm not a doctor, at least not yet. So welcome everyone in the name of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University and AGBU. I would like to wish you all an International Women's Day that is filled with activism and a commitment to sustain our environment. We have a long way to go and the road has been proven bumpier each year. So this event is nothing but a glimpse of what we at the Arab Institute for Women and AGBU strive to do to shed light on gender rights and the need for gender justice. If I am to tell you a bit more about the Arab Institute for Women, well, it was established in 1973 to preserve LAU's legacy as a college for women. And in fact, AiW is the first institute in the region to work at the intersection of academia and activism. So here at LAU, at the Arab Institute for Women, we promote interdisciplinary research with a view to social change and policy change. We create and share knowledge on women and gender issues. We build partnerships and form strategic collaborations to address violence against women in all its forms. We provide capacity building and continuing education programming that focuses on women and gender issues. We connect academics and practitioners working to carve a space for women at the decision-making table, and we engage in global dialogues on women and gender issues to raise awareness and rally action. And this is one such example. We bring together stakeholders to advance these issues through shared discussions and shared agendas. The Institute is an independent convener that basically connects and serves academics and activists, policymakers and practitioners, students and the youth in Lebanon and the Arab region. We at AiW know that gender equality is the key to sustainable development. We at AiW work in the region despite the conflicts, insecurities, chaos, and instability. We believe that change is bound to happen, and we will be there to build the kind of region we would like to see. We at AiW strive to serve as a platform for our youth to develop and advance their feminist agendas in the making and help them take action and claim their space and make their voices heard. I will stop here and leave the floor now to our moderator and panelists and promise you many more future and fruitful collaborations between AiW and AGBU. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, and welcome all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us today for this event. My name is Vahatin Kabakyan, and I'm the Climate Change Advisor at UNDP in Lebanon, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. Just a few words before we could start our panel discussion. We have three parallel panels taking place in a row. So March 8th is the International Women's Day, as you know, and this year's UN theme is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow, which focuses on the contributions of women and girls around the world who are leading the change on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and response to build a more sustainable future for all. The Glasgow Women's Leadership Statement, which is an outcome from the 26th Conference of Parties of Climate Change, or what is known as Climate Summit, does call for countries to support the leadership of women and girls on climate action at all levels of society and politics. While this reflects the growing awareness of gender-responsive action, the efforts so far made fall well short of what is needed around the world. In fact, climate change is recognized as one of the most challenging issues of the 21st century and perhaps beyond. And the recent Intergovernmental Panels on Climate Change report depicts the situation quite grim and really dire. So without the full consideration of women in the fight against climate change, we risk of losing that fight. Now, in parallel, there's the SDG 5 that concerns gender equality and empowering all women and girls. Gender equality, again, is not a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. So today is an appropriate time to engage in such a conversation, especially in the region, which is going through a great number of challenges and assessing the different ways forward for it to be complete without the active participation of women is futile. We have today exceptional panelists and experts on the topic. So there's in the field, and they will be sharing with us their insights on gender, role of women, and climate change all combined together. Again, before I open up the floor for we start our first panel, let me remind you with the few rules that we have. Q&A will follow after each panel. We do encourage you to ask questions as much as you want. We will strive to answer the questions as much as possible. Without further ado, let me start with introducing our first panelist on the Gender Equality Day for Sustainable Tomorrow panel. So that's the first panel. So we have with us Dr. Natasha Hall. She is a senior fellow with the Middle East program, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She has over 15 years of experience as an analyst, a researcher, and practitioner in complex humanitarian emergencies and conflict-affected areas with a specialty in the Middle East. She has worked with NGOs and the government in over 15 countries in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, the Southern Caucasus, and Europe. Her work has focused on conflict resolution, governance, displacement, environmental issues, resilience, and civilian protection. Dr. Hall, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Also not a doctor yet, but I'll work on it. So I think I'd be remiss starting the discussion as the environment, a healthy environment is a human right, without saying that just a few months ago, the UN Human Rights Council recognized for the first time that having a clean and healthy, sustainable environment is actually a human right. And I should note that this resolution was the product of decades of activism, and it's a wonderful step, I think, in acknowledging this fundamental right. Many countries have also attempted to expand legislation on environmental health and labor protections. And in many of the countries I worked in, including Armenia and Lebanon, labor and environmental laws are actually quite good, but the resources and the will to enforce them are nearly non-existent. And in countries affected by conflict or those in transition, so the places I focus on, the situation is even more dire. So today I wanted to go beyond the UN resolutions and even the laws within countries themselves for the next few minutes to talk about what a healthy environment as a human right actually means, especially for the countries we're focusing on today and women in particular in the Middle East. So I'm going to start off by being a bit provocative and say that the environment simply hasn't been a priority in the Middle East. And I'm not just talking about the people and their governments. I've lived around the world. I can tell you that the environment is not a priority for the vast majority of people, including here in the US where I am, even if it is affecting their health. But I am talking about NGOs and priorities for environmental organizations. I think the region's relative lack of biodiversity deprioritizes it amongst environmentalists. And for a lot of donor governments, the Middle East has a lot of problems, but for them, environmental quality has not really been one until very recently. And I want to give you an example. I'm just going to try to bring up a couple slides here and share my screen. Let's see. I don't think it's letting me do that. But essentially what I wanted to show you was the levels of death from air pollution around the world. And in this figure, you see high levels of deaths from air pollution around the Middle East, but also other developing areas, or more developing areas, I would say, in India. But the next slide shows essentially the level of incomes in comparison to deaths from air pollution. Now, this figure shows essentially all of the Middle Eastern countries, especially in the Gulf and Iraq, in this upper corner where you have fairly high incomes relative to the rest of the world, and also the highest number of deaths from air pollution. Now, some of this is from natural and unnatural sources, because of the dry air, but both of them will likely increase in future years because of desertification. We're already seeing increasing sandstorms. So, this is a region where the gap between expectations and reality is growing more and more every day. And I'll just sort of unscientifically double that gap for women. And I think that that's why, frankly, in recent years, people are really starting to care. The consequences of failing to deal with environmental issues have spilled out into the streets, from protests throughout Lebanon demanding tolerable waste management to protests for clean water in Iraq and Iran. And the consequences of just numerous years of neglect and corruption and now climate change are essentially colliding. And environmental degradation is now something that really can't be avoided. Basra, which is a place that I've focused on in Iraq, should be an oil-rich territory and therefore have the resources to deal with some of these issues. But it's an unfortunate example of this neglect. Chronic water quality issues have sent thousands to hospitals, and some towns never see a dark night because of the constant flaring from oil wells in their communities. And about 90% of the agricultural land has been all or partially lost due to seawater intrusion. So, I think amongst most of us that work on these issues, we've long known why the environment needs to be prioritized, but I'm going to just reiterate quickly some basic ones that I think for the future, it will definitely need to be prioritized. And the first is, of course, population growth. I think while the Middle East population growth is leveling off, it was the highest growing population in the world up to 2000. And so that population momentum from those surge years will double the population by 2050. And then second, I would say rapid urbanization and the continued loss of the already limited arable land in the region. And this is forcing many to move towards what are overstressed cities already. And that leads me to my next point and sort of the focus of this chat today, which is climate change. The Middle East is a very thin margin of error. 12 out of the 17 most water-stressed countries in the world are in the Middle East and North Africa. And the region is cited to be one of the most affected by climate change and by warming. And this means that more and more are going to start giving up agriculture and moving towards cities. And this also means that more women will likely need to enter the urban workforce in the future. And then fourth, and this is where I sort of have my concentration, is the instability and the conflict in the region. And countries in the midst of conflict or in a transition period are not in a great position to create a healthy environment. And nearly all countries in the Middle East and North Africa, unfortunately, outside of the oil-rich Gulf, can be categorized as one of these at this point. In one of the places I focus on, in Syria, in the Northeast, rivers now glisten with oil from makeshift oil rigs from the past 10 years. And children that survived the Islamic State are digging through mountains of trash today. People, and disproportionately women, are inhaling low-grade diesel every day as heating sources, if they can even get that. In other cases, I've walked into rooms where people were essentially burning trash for warmth. So I think this problem has grown more acute as displacement becomes more prolonged and as people lose their savings and assets, as they don't have community members to support them. But I think as these crises become protracted, as they have worldwide, dealing with these issues also can't wait for an acceptable end to the conflict. They couldn't wait for yesterday. So I think with that lack of capacity or will or both, the question is what can be done, especially for those who might be most impacted, but have the least power to change the status quo. My colleagues and I wrote a paper last year called Sustainable States, the Environment, Governance, and the Future of the Middle East. And in it, we argue that unacceptable and unsustainable service provision is increasingly a flashpoint for instability, and that this will only increase in the years ahead. And the failure to provide reliable and environmentally sustainable utilities reaches beyond inconvenience at this point. It harms nutrition and health, it weakens economies, as Lebanon has seen, and it poisons politics also, as Lebanon has seen. And I think by focusing on service provision, water, waste, and power provision, you're essentially mainstreaming the concept of building a healthy environment. And notably, I think the positive impacts would also disproportionately benefit women who are disproportionately impacted by bad service provision. They are typically the ones that have to take time to boil unclean water. And in many countries, they are the ones spending the most time indoors with dirty fuel burning. But I guess the question is, how do you do this in countries which lack resources or are corrupt or unstable? And here we sort of accepted that many citizens can't wait for a competent central government to form. And this doesn't mean that they shouldn't keep trying, but I think something needs to happen in the meantime. So, I mean, what we've seen in our research is that new technologies like bioremediation, constructed wetlands, I think hold some promise for things like wastewater treatment, which are typically very expensive, and they don't require many inputs. And I think constant civic engagement to promote the reuse of wastewater where possible is also going to be essential throughout the region. I've also seen in parts of Lebanon and even Syria that solar panels are now unconnected to the grid, but could feasibly be connected to it in better times. And they also hold promise, especially as the cost of solar continues to decrease. And in Lebanon in particular, it's been kind of a tech hub for a lot of these future technologies and for creative ways, especially to deal with solid waste. Compostability is turning biodegradable trash into compost. Others have created zero waste landfills. But unfortunately, I think because of the situation there, many innovators are looking outside to expand rather than their homeland, which obviously needs them more than ever before. So I guess this is a call to NGOs and UN agencies and donor governments to support these efforts, but they also need to support civil society and academia's efforts to be a watchdog. Because there's only so much that I think decentralized strategies can accomplish if the major sources of pollution and unsustainable water usage continue. And civil society analysis and outcry on everything from pollution in the Litani River Basin in Lebanon to the Amalsar gold mine in Armenia gives me hope. But those people are up against very strong vested interests. And until there can be a real independent, strong monitoring and regulatory bodies, local communities need to work together. Civil society is also part of that monitoring body. And it's there that there can be a safeguard against climate change and other disasters. So I'm gonna sort of conclude by leaving you with this. What I see when I look at the Middle East and Armenia for that matter is an opportunity. I think people see the effects of climate change and environmental degradation and pollution in their daily lives. In 1970, Americans also saw pollution in their everyday lives. Lakes were catching on fire, smog just blanketed cityscapes, and trash was piling up. And then in April of the same year, more than 20 million people poured out into the streets for the first Earth Day. and it remains the largest single-day protest in human history. And it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States and the Clean Air and Water Act, amongst other pieces of legislation. Now, we'll constantly be facing other crises, but I think the water we drink, what we use to cook our food, these are everyday things that matter, and they aren't working in a lot of parts of the Middle East. And I think, to conclude, I think that in itself can be a catalyst for change. So I'm looking forward to my fellow panelists to discuss sort of what they've found in terms of civil society efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And I think it's quite interesting how you bring in the compound nature of the issues at hand. Let's move to the other second panelist, Dr. Znainati, who is a professor of comparative literature and the dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at the Lebanese American University. Her specialty revolves around sustainable development, gender, and identity. She's been a campaigner for gender equity in higher education and a strong advocate for innovative and empowering pedagogy. Dr. Znainati, you have the floor, and please, I would like to request to stick to the 10-minute mark per presenters. You have the floor, Dr. Znainati.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm going to follow on from Natasha and offer you a provocative presentation, and I hope that it will be well received. The title of my talk is Doing Gender with Culture in Mind. Gender, of course, implicates us all. We live it, we perform it, we reinvent it, we challenge it. Some of us reject the notion of a gendered identity altogether. And whatever our relationship to this fluid notion of gendered identity, we cannot escape it. And I'm sure this audience knows that since time immemorial, we have all reflected on what it means for a person to grow into an assigned gendered identity or to be socialized into performing the normative role that is expected of them. And as various societies experienced their versions of enlightenment, as they divested from the rigid, unscientific traditions and beliefs that were imposed on them by forces that sought to control the person by way of controlling the whole of society, then naturally we started questioning received knowledge about the seemingly straightforward relationship of biological constitution and gendered identity. In recent years, our understanding of the fluidity of our gendered identities has been deepening, as we have come to accept that it is neither desirable nor necessary for any society to define rigidly what a man is, what a man does, what a woman should do, what a woman must not do. Humanity has eased itself into understanding that human beings are complex and multifaceted. We have come to understand that people thrive when they feel free to express themselves authentically. We're not robots. We cannot exist in specific predefined terms, and we naturally resist prescribed behavior. This is true of our relationship to political autocracy as much as it is in our relationships to our bodies. So once we realize that we are born neither as men or as women, that we have to work at becoming an individual on a spectrum which has the categories of man and woman as extreme identities, once we understand that each of us exists somewhere on that spectrum and we are free to perform our identities according to our sense of ourselves, then we naturally look around us and we begin to question rigidly enforced social and political practices that we have received and are expected to follow. So when we look around us, we need to recognize that most economic structures in the majority world are predicated on outdated understandings of gender, whereby women's economic contribution remains strictly codified and restricted. And I am talking about the majority world here. When we look around us, we acknowledge that political opportunities in the majority world do not promote equal participation from all genders. And we must also remember that cultural codes and practices remain powerful obstructive factors that deter individuals from doing their gender. So when we do gender, we do politics. When we do gender, we do economics. When we do gender, we do culture. We do this by pushing for change in the very fabric of our societies. And today I propose that we must start with culture. Doing gender with culture in mind involves us pushing for a spectrum of opportunities to be made available for all members of society, regardless of their gendered identities. This could take the form of, for example, leadership opportunities in political decision-making that are inclusive of all genders. Intergenerational collaboration and awareness raising about the modern possibilities of doing gender in non-traditional ways. In a way, we invert the mentor-mentee relationship and have perhaps the younger generation tell us what it's like to do gender in the contemporary world. Maybe the implementation of inclusive finance structures that consider applicants on their merit and not on their gender identities, their status, religious affiliation, political persuasion. But also it could take the form of offering vulnerable members of our society appropriate measures of protection in the private and the public spheres. Those are just some examples. When we do gender with culture in mind, we must demand a revision of leadership structures. If we doing politics as we do gender in an open, receptive, accepting, agile, malleable mindset allows us to invent rather than import or imitate. It allows us to invent leadership structures that are compatible with our imagined futures. The world, especially this world right here in the MENA region, is craving brave leadership. All over the world, people have been suffering from leaders who have failed to show courage, facing the threats of the global pandemic, leaders who have resisted adapting to the exigencies of the ever-changing technological environment, leaders who have perpetuated antiquated, irrelevant, and ineffectual legacies that they have inherited. We need brave leaders, those who lead while acknowledging that power, like gendered identity, exists on a continuum. Leaders who inspire through their personality and their abilities to influence through credibility, rational persuasion, participatory decision-making. Leaders who do their gender authentically and inspire us to do the same. So on this International Women's Day, my hope is that we can open a dialogue that allows for an examination of the fluid category of woman, and that reminds everyone that such a category is malleable, it is agile, it can be even more inclusive, it is positively unstable, and it can be even richer with diversity. I hope that while we attempt to examine the impact of climate change on the lives and the efforts of individuals who identify or are identified as women, that we continue to acknowledge and advocate for an intersectional and transnational approach that allows each individual to do gender in a way that is most authentic to them. I won't talk for long because I'm hoping to discuss gender as a spectrum in cultural settings, but I will conclude by thanking you for inviting me to contribute to this symposium, thanking the Armenian General Benevolent Union and the Arab Institute for Women at LAU for creating this forum, which I hope will allow us to share position statements like mine in a safe and constructive space. So I look forward to a rich and varied day of discussion and debate.
Thank you, Dr. Znainati. It's interesting how you put it really out there that the older generation is actually playing a role in defining the gender, and perhaps that is really not well understood within that generation of what gender is. Let me get into the few questions that we have, but I do encourage the participants to, in the coming 10 minutes or so, to raise their questions in this Q&A session. I apologize, I just lost power. So there's one question to Natasha in the Q&A box. Natasha, what is expected to happen in regards to the position of women in the world when the population does double? I think that comes from you mentioning the regionally that population will probably double by 2050. If I'm not wrong, that's somewhere around 650 million people. Natasha, let's hear it.
I mean, I think what one of the issues is just unemployment as well in the region. You already have very high unemployment, even though in a lot of countries, my own country, Jordan, most of the women aren't in the workforce. So what happens also when you have a more productive workforce, what tends to happen is that some of these sort of factors of climate change also increase because you have just more productivity. So I think for me, the question is, how do you make that more sustainable, more environmentally friendly? Jordan has made some inroads in terms of using solar and also alternative energies so that, you know, there can still continue to be opportunities for women and for men throughout the region, but in such a way that it doesn't necessarily further degrade the environment, because that's what we've seen for the past several decades, basically since the Industrial Revolution. And I think the challenge there is how to do that in such a way when you do have a lot of sort of turmoil in the region and lack of connectivity between different areas as well. So I think that's one of the ways that it will affect women. You have a lot more female single-headed households now. So there is going to be a lot of women who need work, who have to have work, who will be competing with men for work. And so I think that will also sort of create some tensions as well. But I think that in terms of the population doubling, there absolutely just needs to be a more sustainable way forward when it comes to economic growth. But also, as I said, with service provision. Because we're pushing on empty at this point in a lot of these countries, my own country that I'm originally from, Jordan in particular, but that will only increase and worsen with time if we don't get on this right now.
Thank you, Natasha. Let's move to the second question, and that one is directed to Dr. Zainati. So how can we modify and modernize the world's view of women and our roles, taking into consideration the cultural constraints that are already in place?
That's a lovely question. Thank you very much. I concluded, my final thought was around an intersectional approach. And I really did say it was a provocative talk. It was just 10 minutes of a much bigger argument that I'm trying to make about destabilizing the category of woman. And I think this destabilization will allow us to respect and appreciate the various definitions that the role of woman takes on in the different parts of this region. So instead of reporting policies that take it for granted that the category of woman is stable, I would like to see policies taking into account the fact that there is no such thing as the category of woman. So I'm sure many colleagues on this panel who work in generating data and publishing data, reporting data, feel the pressure of bringing together a lot of information from diverse sources and putting it under the category woman. For me, the way forward is to really disaggregate this data to understand what kind of women are we talking about and what does that label mean to them. Are they performing roles that they never used to perform 40 years ago? And if so, let us implement policies that take into account the changing roles of women as heads of households, women who are now the main economic providers in their villages or in their households. So I would love to see a more intersectional approach that teaches us to appreciate just the diversity of what a woman is actually doing. So doing gender now might surprise people. And I know there's a lot of case studies coming up today. I cannot wait to hear what our colleagues will report on what it's like to do gender as a female. So in a nutshell, I would like more disaggregated data and a revision of the category of woman so that it encompasses this intersectional understanding.
Right. Thanks for that, Dr. Znanati. Also, Natasha, we have a couple of more questions. We'll get back to those towards the end. But let us move to, and I do invite you, if you have the answers, you can type as well in the chat box and directly with and engaging with the people that are asking the questions. So feel free. Let's move then to panel 2. So we're looking at now the relationship between climate change and gender in cases from the region. First, we have with us Dr. Nadeem Farazallah, who is the director of the Climate Change and the Environment Program at the American University of Beirut, Assam Paris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. His current research focuses on the impact of climate change on human settlements and activities through extreme events of flooding and droughts, impact of climate change on security, and the nexus of water, energy, food, and climate change, with focus on adaptation and resilience, and recovery of devastated land due to anthropogenic activities such as wars, farming, quarrying, etc. Dr. Nadeem, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vahak. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a nice opportunity to approach climate change from a different perspective than we traditionally do. And a lot of our work that we do is policy oriented, etc. And we always talk about gender mainstreaming and putting it in. And I want to share some of the thoughts that, why should we focus on gender in climate change when we're talking about climate change? The thing is, climate change is not just the science of it all and what we're counting in terms of dollars in damages, etc. The issue of climate change is basically a social justice issue. It affects society and communities worldwide, each along their most vulnerable aspect. And vulnerable groups are extremely susceptible to impacts of climate change. And this then begs the look at how does gender inequalities fare in climate change? Well, climate change exacerbates these inequalities. And when you look at the gender divisions of labor and looking at the feminization of poverty, there are great differences in how climate change affects men and women. And if you will look at the aspect of women in this picture, we see that natural disasters reduce women's life expectancy. As disasters worsen, so do their effects, and the shorter life of women is expected. Women are more likely to die as a result of disasters, and these include heat waves, floods, storms, fires, and droughts. And environmental hazards due to climate change increase the risk also of diseases. So dengue fever, malaria, cholera, all of these are associated with impacts of climate change. And women are at the forefront of this. Women are at the take a lead in bringing water to homes. And we keep taking this as you know, in many parts of our world, people take this as a laughing matter. But when you look at who really watches out when water comes into the house, or where do we go to get water, and how women take care of that much more than men. And if we look at the impacts, I'm going to go through several quickly. Crop failure is one impact of climate change, and it affects household provision, food provision, and also it means as crop fails, you need to gather more and more and work more and more in the field. And most laborers, if we look at the Beka, most field laborers at harvest time, etc., are women. So there is more work for women in the field. And this work is not OSHA protected, etc. It is tough labor. Fuel shortages, then this goes into what Natasha said about burning unclean fuel, unhealthy fuel in households. Water shortages, resource scarcities, natural disasters, diseases, all of these factor into this. So how does the climate change worsen the cycle? Environmental instabilities, droughts, floods, etc., lead to insecure livelihoods, which then increase the burden on households, financial, economic, etc. And this puts women out mostly, and then younger kids, from education to work in the field, and then reduces education, which reduces income generation, and then we start missing out on sustainable coping strategies for people. So for decades, we know that women have been adapting to rapid environmental changes. They are the people taking the lead in households to adapt to whatever changing circumstances we have. And climate change is a major addition to and challenge to this ability to adapt. So how do we counter that? We have to have gender responsive climate principles and actions. In adaptation, there should be gender sensitive tools and methods. In mitigation, these should include safeguards for reducing exposure and production of greenhouse gases from household activities where women are in control. There are technological issues that should be taken into consideration that take gender into account in order to support adaptation and mitigation actions. Finance must be much more gender sensitive, and capacity building is critical to adaptation, and it has to have gender incorporated into this. And very importantly to me, approaches to loss and damage from climate impacts has to address vulnerable groups, especially women and children, and it has to have a gender disaggregated information to assess the risk and damage of losses. So many climate change policies are gender sensitive, but these have to be put into action through policy language that's more specific, knowledge, products, toolkits, checklists, any processes for implementing policy obligations must be developed and implemented through gender sensitive lenses. Sufficient funding for gender policy obligations must be incorporated into any fund that goes in. And then this has to be coupled with monitoring and reporting on progress towards gender equality. Importantly, women must be given leadership role in adaptation, in climate action. This, I will close with this so that I don't run over time, and I'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadeem. I mean, you just outlined the remaining of our combined, so we're combining panel 2 and 3 together now. We will move quickly into looking at case studies from the region, but also just, you know, very much going back to your last point, and the inclusion of women in decision making, specifically in climate change, but I would argue in any decision that is made at the governance level. So again, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Maya Naamen, Executive Director of Lebanon Reforestation Initiative. It's a Lebanese NGO that works on improving practices in reforestation, forest management, land use planning, quarry restoration, riparian restoration, and wildfire management. She holds a dual title degree in Anthropology and Comparative and International Education from the Penn State University, and has been working in the forestry field in Lebanon with the Lebanon Reforestation Initiative since 2011. Dr. Naamen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And it's been an amazing pleasure listening to all the inspiring talks so far. And thank you so much for AGBU and AiW for giving me the chance to actually be part of this amazing discussion and sharing with you some of our thoughts and also some of our work on climate change adaptation. We're talking mostly on the case of Lebanon. And really in Lebanon, what's projected in terms of climate change impact are, just to make it simple, it's a graph with a lot of details, but basically we're expecting more precipitation that's condensed on a shorter period and then longer drought periods on the other side. That by itself leads to accentuated risks. So we have accentuated risk of fires, of heat waves, of droughts, decline in quantities of water, and that is affecting water for households, but also water for agriculture, for biodiversity, and that by itself will lead to reduction or decrease in biodiversity affecting both flora and fauna, and then an increase of the chances of diseases and outbreaks. We also have the accentuated precipitation in a short period of time is going to also lead to risk of landslides, soil erosion, and a lot of flash floods that we're starting to see some of them happening in the last couple of years. So if we kind of summarize critical pipeline effects, we can group them into a degradation of natural ecosystems. We're already seeing some of that happening. We have some that we've managed to do a long time ago, but climate change is helping on the rest of it. And then associated ecosystem services being declining as well. And then increased risk on food supplies, leading to food insecurity, and increased stress on livelihoods. So where is gender in all of this? Climate change obviously affects everybody. It affects the whole planet, it's affecting everybody, but the difference in how it's affecting is really related to, and not necessarily men and women, but really the people who are more vulnerable, the people who are less prepared, and then those who are less resilient. And so if we think of it this way, climate change is affecting mostly the most vulnerable, mostly the people who are not really ready to face those challenges. And then we take in parallel some national data from Lebanon on gender related data. So in terms of education, we have a very similar level of education between men and women in Lebanon in terms of schooling years. But then if we look at the workforce, we have only around 23.5% of women that are part of the labor force compared to 70.59% men. And that's by a UNDP report published recently on gender and climate change. And then if we look at the gender wage gap, how much women are actually less paid than men, we see a difference between 20 and 30% less wages for women than men on similar jobs, on basically same type of activities. Then we look at what we were just talking about with Dr. Nadim and the others, decision-making process. In Lebanon, we have only 4.7% of seats in the parliament that are occupied by women. We have 5.4% only in local governments, so municipalities, local authorities. We have a very low representation of women in those as well. And then the worst part actually in terms of climate change adaptation is that when you look at land ownership of agricultural lands, you only have 7.1% of lands that are owned by women, and the rest is all owned by men. And that doesn't mean that it's a disaster in terms of climate change adaptation. It just means that women are less prepared and less able to cope with climate change. If they want to take a decision of actually adopting new strategies or new technologies, they don't even own the land to implement those technologies. So there are some inherent challenges in women playing their role effectively, equally to men, in in climate change adaptation. On the opposite side, we see a lot of reports showing a crucial role for women in water management. Water conservation, women are always mentioned to be a major player in water conservation, especially on the household level. But then that's, again, a theory that I like to get out of, because we keep always putting the women in the household section and saying, okay, yeah, women can, do water management better because they manage the household. But that doesn't mean that men shouldn't be responsible for managing the water or solid waste or energy within the household. So there is also some breaking of the usual concepts and the way we think of them. It's kind of what Dr. Jnainati was hinting to in the beginning, that we need to have a more fluid understanding of that. And even in our gender reports that are being issued on the national level, there is still some stereotyping that's embedded in that puts women in some categories and men in other. I'd like to look at it more in terms of opportunities in general. We have the climate change is a fact, it's a reality. We need to face that fact. And so everybody should be equally able and prepared and have the tools to cope with that and to really help each other in facing it. Because again, climate change is a global issue. One person cannot adapt to it on its own. It has to be a collective effort and an equally shared effort among men and women and basically everybody on the planet. Lebanon Reforestation Initiative is an NGO that's been working since 2010, but registered since 2014 in Lebanon on several programs. One of them is climate change resilience. And I'm just going to share with you a couple of small stories of women participation since International Women's Day. So to celebrate some good contributions from women to restoration and climate change adaptation in Lebanon. One example is from the north of Lebanon, the North Bekaa area, which is the semi-arid area of Lebanon, one of the driest in the region, where back in 2010, we went and saw a land that was completely barren, basically, and we met the community. And at that point, we met Huda, the lady in the left photo, who was a school teacher and a sports person. She loves running. And then she was all excited about probably doing reforestation. She was a key person in mobilizing the community, getting everybody together to actually move this reforestation project forward. We end up naming it the Forest of Huda because she was so passionate about it. Not because she's a woman, she could have been the Forest of Fahakim if he was the one motivated. But having those individuals that push things forward, that motivate others, that want to make things happen, has turned this land into a green land. And then we started thinking with her about how to motivate other women, how to improve the resilience of women, especially in the current conditions where we have less water, we have more economic needs, they have to support the livelihoods of their families. And so we introduced an agroforestry concept in the region, and we started planting herbs and other types of native plants, basing on the native ecosystem. But we end up getting to the point where we have a brand with her name that's selling infusion tea from native herbs, mixes that are studied very well in terms of what goes with what and all of that. And there are 6 women now in the town working together to produce those infusion tea, and then we're helping in marketing those. So this is just a small example of how, motivated, hardworking woman, she's planted those trees herself. Those women have planted the agroforestry system themselves. They can do it. There's no reason why they cannot do it. And men have helped. It's been a collective effort with both. Another example is in Haitse, in the southern part of the Bekaa, where we had a land that was completely abandoned for the municipality. And with a project with FAO, we worked with the cooperative of Najmat al-Sabah. We restored the terraces and then we planted them, and they've been harvesting from those terraces native species for the last 5 years actually now, and they've been producing products from those and then selling them locally and even internationally. So, using this small piece of land, they were able to develop different products and sustain their families, which is one way of conserving the soil, because that was a land that was at high soil erosion risk, and at the same time supporting the local communities using native and biodiverse ecosystems. So I just want to close out with this. Men and women can equally do everything they would like to do and they feel that they can do. mean, we usually put stereotypes. We say women cannot prune trees. Here's a little lady. That's not a photo shoot. That's a real life photo of a woman helping us with pruning, cleaning, doing composting. I think Natasha mentioned Compost Baladi. That was a project where we're partnering with them, and women and men equally were working on this. And just a small salute to the civil defense men and women together also fighting fires and helping us protect the forest, which is another way of reducing CO2 emissions and protecting our carbon sink and adapting to climate change. And then men and women working together on science to ensure that we're doing things properly. So really the call today is to look at each other equally. Think that if anyone wants to do something, they should be able to do it, and kind of break a bit as much as we can the stereotyping that we have, because that's the only way we can really adapt to the huge impact of climate change that we're facing now. So thank you. I'll be happy to take any comments and questions.
Thank you, Maya. As you might see, I've lost power for the last half an hour or so. Probably you won't be seeing me anymore. I probably need to turn off my camera. But let's move ahead. We still have 3 presenters in half an hour. So I would really ask the presenters to stick to the 10 minutes or so time allocated, so that we do have time at the end to take up a bit more of the questions. But yeah, let me introduce Dr. Abdelazem Abdelrahman. She has throughout her career focused on in an urban climate change sector. So she has relevant experience in the field of local climate zones, urban climate, urban microclimate, climate models, environmental studies, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and she is a climate change coordinator and consultant in the field of social sciences. She has experience in geography using GIS and RS tools. So she's also a rapporteur of the National Committee, the Egyptian Scientific Committee on Problems of the Environment, and Academy of Science Research and Technology. You have the floor.
Thanks for the invitation. And in my language, Arabic, Egypt. هنتكلم في بعض المجتمعات المحلية والنوع الاجتماعي هنا في مصر، خاصة بالمجتمع المدني، وأيضا بعض الدراسات اللي حصلت من المجتمع العلمي. احنا بتواجهنا بعض المشكلات، بس أحب أعرفكم إن المسمى الريفي عندنا في المجتمعات دي بيكون في الدلتا فقط، لكن احنا بنقول على باقي المحافظات الصعيد أو المحافظات الساحلية. بتختلف طبيعة النساء في تلك المناطق بطبيعة النشاط الاقتصادي. احنا مشكلتنا كمجتمع مدني وبعض المجموعات التركيز اللي احنا عملناها خاصة لبعض النساء غير المتعلمات أو متوسطة التعليم، إن مفهوم التغيرات المناخية اللي احنا بنتكلم عنه في المجتمع المدني، مؤتمرات في العلوم، مش مفهوم ثابت عندهم على أرض الواقع. هم الذي بيهتموا بيه وبيضر نشاطاتهم اليومية، لأن معظم أنشطتهم ليست ثابتة، هي أنشطة يومية، حالة اقتصادية يوم بيوم. هو التطرف اللي بيحصل في الطقس زي السيول عندنا في الساحل الشمالي، دايما بيبقى فيه تطرف بيحصل في بعض أيام معينة للزيادة في المطر، بيحصل سيل بيبوظ بعض الأماكن الزراعية، بعض البحيرات. في بعض النساء زي محافظات ساحلية زي كفر الشيخ التعامل اليومي معاهم بيصطادوا السمك بإيديهم أو بعصاية، ممكن شفتوها على الجدران الفرعونية بالطريقة البدائية، ودي حياتهم اليومية. في الصعيد النشاط الرئيسي الزراعة، ولكن معظم النساء هي مساعدات للرجال في الزراعة. النشاط الرئيسي ليهم هو اللي بيخرج، أو النشاط الجانبي جزء من الأنشطة الزراعية زي تربية الحيوانات، تربية الطيور، بعض المناحل، مناحل العسل، بعض المخلفات اللي بتخرج من الأنشطة الزراعية زي زراعة الموز. بعض المجتمعات المدنية بتقدر إنها تجمع بعض الفتيات صغيرة السن أو المراهقات المتسربات من التعليم وبيدخلوا ضمن هذه الأنشطة. هذه الأنشطة بتتضرر بشكل كبير خاصة في محافظات الصعيد بسبب تطرف في درجات الحرارة، سواء درجات حرارة عالية فأفسد بعض الزراعات أو المزروعات زي الفواكه، الموز، الرمان، فما قدروش إن هم يستخدموا المخلفات بتاعته في بعض الأعوام، خاصة العام الماضي زراعة الرمان وزراعة المانجا حصل فيها تطرف وقلة في المحصول بسبب ارتفاع في درجات الحرارة، إلى جانب الأوقات السيل بالذات اللي بتحدث في مصر في فصل الربيع وفي فصل الصيف. بتحصل مشاكل كتيرة في الزراعات وفي البيوت وللنساء دي أيضا إنها ما عندهاش حماية يومية، وإلى جانب إن هم برضو عندهم مفهوم، وده المعظم من خلال مقابلاتنا ليهم، إن تغير المناخ سواء ارتفاع درجات الحرارة سيل هي دي حاجة طبيعية. هي مشكلتهم الرئيسية مثلا في التربة الزراعية، في بعض الأنشطة اللي بيستخدموها منتجات الألبان، مرض بعض المواشي مش ما فيش بعض العلاج ليهم بيكون سريع. فهي دي المشاكل الرئيسية ليهم. التغيرات المناخية بيعتبروها ان دي حالة الجو وانا ما اقدرش ان انا اغير فيه او ان انا اثر فيه، ان دي طبيعة إلهية. فده مشكلة احنا بنواجهها في المجتمع المدني دلوقتي. احنا بدأنا ان احنا نعمل يعني الشعار اللي ورايا ده الخلفي مبادرة مصرية اسمها مبادرة منصة الوسيط البيئي، مهتمة بالعدالة المناخية، وخاصة إحدى مبادئها النوع الاجتماعي وإدارة التعليم للفتيات والنساء، لأن التربية المناخية أو التعليم البيئي ده مش متواجد حتى مش هنقول من الصغر أو المفهوم نفسه. أنا دايما المتداول في الدول العربية هي تدوير المخلفات، لأنه طبعا مكسب كبير لبعض الشركات والصناعات والمجتمع المدني، وهو ده اللي سائد. لكن بعض الأنشطة اليومية مثلا، أو إن أنا أدعم بعض الفتيات في الصعيد أو بعض الفتيات في الدلتا أو حتى في المحافظات اللي احنا بنسميها عندنا محافظات حدودية زي شمال سيناء أو الوادي الجديد، أكبر منتج للبلح والنخيل، ومعظم النساء شغالين في إحدى المخلفات اللي بتخرج من النخل وإدارة المخلفات دي. فده كله مش بيبقى حتى كتمويل مناخي احنا بنقدر ان احنا نتعامل معاه، لان انشطه هذه النساء هي انشطه فرديه، ما بيطلعوش انتاج كبير مثلا ان انا اقدر ان احنا نجيب لهم دعم وان احنا نقدر نشتغل عليه. فبالتالي التطرف في الطقس والتعامل معاه بنبداها بالتوعيه بالمفهوم. بعض النساء طبيعي بتستجاب، اي حد بيكون ليه مصلحه او تطوير للذات في بعض المناطق بيستجاب لينا وبيتعاون مثلا في المجتمع المدني وبيقدر ان هو يفهم الوضع الحالي. لكن اكتر التضررات اللي بتحصل كتغيرات مناخيه هي طبيعي بتكون على المدى البعيد، فالناس نفسها حتى مش شرط من متعلمين او مش متعلمين، ممكن ناس مش مستوعبه. هيحصل بعد 10 سنين، هيحصل بعد 50 سنه، فانا مش هتضرر، مش لازم ان انا اعمل له حساب، لان طبيعي احنا بنحدد الخطر لو هو جنبي دلوقتي. لو هو هيحصل سيل مثلا، الزلزال، المخاطر الطبيعيه دي نشطه جدا وبيهتموا بيها لانها بتبقى فجائيه ويوميه، بس تعودوا عليها. لكن تغير مناخ او يحدث اي مشاكل مستقبليه، رغم ان معظم النساء الريفيات معتمده بشكل كبير على النشاط الزراعي او الانشطه الجانبيه للزراعه من الطيور، تربيه مواشي، كل ده بيتاثر بارتفاع في درجات الحراره، في زياده في المطر، في تغيرات حتى في الرطوبه مع المطر، واتجاهات للرياح بتاثر على قطع اشجار في المناطق دي. بيوتهم نفسها في بعض البيوت في الصعيد وفي المناطق الريفيه الفقيره لا زالت من الطين او بوس او قش. فاي امطار او حتى رياح شديده، ريح الخمسيني اللي عندنا بدأت في مصر من كام يوم، بتكون شديدة في بعض الأماكن الصحراوية زي الواحات في سيوة، زي مناطق حدودية زي محافظة مرسى مطروح، بتأثر كتير على هؤلاء النساء والفتيات، وخاصة أنشطتهم الاقتصادية. فده الأساسي بالنسبة للنساء في المناطق الريفية، إن أكتر اللي بيتضرر ليهم هو الطقس أو ده مفهومهم. فاحنا بنحاول نبدأ معاهم من النقطة دي حتى نوصل في النهاية إن في تغيرات مناخية هنبدأ إن إحنا نشتغل عليها. لكن الشغل الأساسي اللي على الأرض الواقع مع النساء وتعليمهم في التعليم البيئي والمشروعات اللي بتستهدفهم، إن نتعامل إزاي مع الطقس المتطرف أو الخسائر اللي بتحصل لنا، لأن الأساسي عندهم هو العائد الاقتصادي أو النشاط الاقتصادي. وزي برضو أنا بشوف إن زي الحل البيئي لو مش متواكب مع حل اقتصادي مش هيتنفذ، سواء في نساء، مجتمعات ريفية، مشروعات كبرى، كل ده ملوش أي أهمية لو إحنا تجاهلنا الواقع الاقتصادي الناس مش ما بتستجابش معانا. او حل مثلا هنشوفه بعد 10 15 سنه، او حتى هنشوفه بعد 3 4 شهور. في ناس نشاطها وحياتها اليوميه دخلها يومي، فهي مش بتفكر بشكل كبير او بشكل مستقبلي. فدي احدى نقاط الضعف اللي انا بعتبرها متواجده، وبنحاول ان احنا نتعامل معاها ونشتغل عليها عشان نحقق المفهوم اللي بنسعى ليه او اللي منتشر عالميا حاليا، اللي هو العداله المناخيه، خاصه دمج النوع الاجتماعي في العمل المناخي والتعليم، لان الاساسي في التربيه والتعليم والتنشئ هي السيدات او النساء، وهي اللي بتتحمل العائق الاكبر. حتى في بعض الاجزاء من الاراضي الزراعيه، دلوقتي احنا عندنا اراضي في بعض المدن بالقرب من محافظات البحر الاحمر اسمها الارض الصفراء او الارض صحراويه جديده، فالرجال بيروحوا هم يشتغلوا في الارض دي، والسيدات بيشتغلوا في الارض القديمه اللي جنب البيوت بتاعتهم عشان ما يبقاش فيه مخاطر عليهم. فبالتالي هي برضو بتتحمل جزء كبير من الدخل والنشاط الاقتصادي مع طقس متطرف زي مفهومهم، او في المستقبل في تغيرات مناخيه هتاثر على بعض تغيير في هذا النشاط الرئيسي ليهم اللي هو النشاط الزراعي. وبرضو الأنشطة الجانبية ما عندهمش فكرة التسويق، لأنها منتجات فردية، فبالتالي فكرة التسويق مش كبيرة معاهم، فبيحصل لهم خسائر لو حدثت أي تطرف في الطقس أو أي تغير في المناخ زي ما احنا بنسميه. فده كان كل الواقع المدني بشكل مبسط. يعني كنت اتمنى اوريكم بعض الافلام او الفيديوهات، ولكن مدتها طويله وكانت المداخله 10 دقائق، فاحنا متشكره جدا لهذه المداخله.
Thank you for that.
Thank
Just a quick recap. She just outlined the impact of climate change in the agricultural sector and the perception of women from of climate change sometimes being something non-anthropogenic. Let's move to the final two presentations. So we have Gayane now from UNDP GCF Armenia's National Adaptation Plan project, communication strategy of the country's National Adaptation Plan that she worked on, targeting and further promotion of policymakers, governmental and non-governmental stakeholders, education institutions, NGOs, as well as the generic public, aiming at awareness raising and adaptation in capacity building, with a strong emphasis on the need of including women in climate change adaptation planning process. Gayane, Harame.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen quickly. Does it work? See everything? Thank you very much. And yes, a lot of things that I'm going to cover were actually covered by my fellow panelists, and I'm happy that we all are on the same page. And just a couple of words about Armenia. We are a landlocked country. However, we face so many negative impacts of climate change. The average annual temperature has increased here by 1.38%, which is more than the average globally. And we already have decrease of average annual precipitations by 14%. So it's climate change is a reality, and we are facing the negative impacts of it every day. And we need to adapt quickly to be able to sustainably develop our country and our economy, and make sure that we don't not only survive but flourish. So if we are looking at just a couple of figures about women in Armenia, so we have 52.6% of Armenia's population are women. And when it comes to education, we're actually we have quite good figures, because 58% over 58% of our women have higher education, and around 85% have secondary education. So we do have still things that we need to work at, but here we are showing quite good statistics. And Women comprise 46% of total employment. However, the majority of them are employed in agriculture, education, and healthcare and social services, whereas in other sectors, they are still underrepresented. Yes, here we also see that the role of women and the positions that they are seen by the society are quite affected by tradition and culture, as was said before. When it comes to managerial positions, women are still at 31%, and even this is an official figure, but even this is mainly due to their leadership role in NGO sector and not private sector. So we still have a lot of things to do in this regard to ensure equality. The country has a gender policy implementation strategy that sets government's priorities for equal participation of women in decision-making process, achieving gender equality in science, education, socioeconomic spheres. There is a council on women's affairs that is responsible for implementation of this strategy, and it is chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister, so quite high representation there. And there is a working group that is coordinating all the works that the council does, and it's led by the Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Affairs. And women are quite active in this body. 63% of the council's members and 92% of working groups members are women. So quite active here. For the climate change, we actually have Interagency Coordination Council on Climate Change, and it is the body that coordinating actions to fulfill the country's obligations under Climate Change Convention, UN Climate Change Convention, Paris Agreement. It has existed before, but now it was reorganized and reestablished again with more emphasis on women participation, and 53% of members are women, including the Deputy Minister of Environment. And women are the vast majority of members in 3 adjacent permanent working groups here, which are different experts and governmental representatives. Women leadership is prominent, as I already said, in NGOs, and we can see that 55% of NGOs in social and 71% of NGOs in environmental fields are led by women. However, women are still significantly underrepresented in decision making at all levels. We have only 24% in parliament, less than 10% in local governance, and the figures are even lower when it comes to community level. And we have only 1 minister, and we have a few female deputy ministers that is respectively 8% and 20%. So we still have a lot of efforts to put in this domain to ensure that women are well represented in decision making. As was already mentioned, we need that to ensure that climate change planning is done properly, and women and their needs are properly represented here. So a couple of words about the project that I'm representing. We are, as Hakan already said, the project is financed by Green Climate Fund and implemented by UNDP in Armenia, and we work with the government to ensure that we develop a national adaptation strategy and an action plan, and include climate change adaptation planning at all levels, and climate change risk should be included in all development projects. While doing so, we prioritize greatly the involvement and participation of women in climate change adaptation planning and implementation on all levels, so national, sectoral, and local levels. As mentioned before, that is important, and I will not just repeat why it is that so important to include women in climate change planning. targets and expected outcomes. So as I said already, adaptation strategy, action plan, as well as 4 sectoral adaptation plans for water, tourism, agriculture, and health sectors will be developed in the frame of our project. And we're working on that, and as well as 2 provincial adaptation plans. So that's why I have some feedback to share with you on vulnerabilities that we have seen in these sectors that I've just mentioned. So I'll start with water, and just to say that there are a couple of issues that are universal for all sectors, like lack of gender disaggregated data, like time poverty. So you might see those repeated across the sectors. So yes, as I said, time poverty that is accentuated, unfortunately, further when women enter the labor force. And this is also because in Armenia, mainly the household related chores are seen mostly as women's responsibilities. So despite women working, they still need to do all the domestic workload. So there is increased workload and exposure to climate risks and disasters due to increasing migration of male family members. And as Dr. Farajal said, this is a quite dangerous and difficult work that women are engaged in and have to face every day, and that deteriorates their lives. They have increased vulnerability towards insufficient water supply and sanitation, which is worsened each year because of increasing climate change impacts. And there are insufficient participation in water management. There are gaps in legislation. There is absence of gender-sensitive monitoring and evaluation systems. So all this greatly increases the vulnerability of women and hinders their adaptation capacity. So the solutions that we have together with our partners proposed and included in the water sectoral adaptation plan are the following: increasing women's participation in decision-making and governance at all levels, and making people in the government understand the importance and the benefits of doing so. Awareness raising among local self-government on the water sector adaptation priorities, with a strong emphasis on women's role, identifying vulnerable social groups and assessing their specific needs on subnational level, because oftentimes this is not done and we do not have gender sensitive vulnerability studies. We should make improved sanitation available in schools and kindergartens, in communities without centralized water supply, because this greatly affects mainly girls at school, and that needs to be addressed. Awareness raising and adaptation capacity building through workshops and trainings aimed at everyone, but women in particular, for water saving, drip irrigation, rainwater use, disaster risk management, and other topics. And of course, there should be water-related and agriculture-related projects implemented on regional and community levels that consider gender approach and ensure women's active participation in them. So the next sector is agriculture, and 48% of rural population are women in Armenia, and the sector employs 37% of the working population, out of which 53%, so the majority are women. However, they receive 35% less payment than men. Significant number of women is involved in informal unpaid work, and they are not registered anywhere, and they are very vulnerable because also further when hitting the pension stage, they are not liable to receive pensions. Women also have limited access to land ownership, as already was noted by Dr. Maya. In that case, less access to financing opportunities, agricultural raw materials, markets, and mobility, and of course, less knowledge and insufficient access to agricultural technologies and practices, especially climate smart agriculture. And there's also the case of time poverty, as I said, which everything together hinders their adaptation capacity and puts them at risk and makes them more vulnerable. So we propose to promote measures aimed at restoring gender equality in general across all sectors, and awareness raising and capacity building in the field of agriculture and agribusiness practices, so women are able to adapt more, know the new ways of doing agriculture that are more sustainable in new temperatures that we have at the moment, and also some water saving technologies, drip irrigation, disaster risk management, etc., to lessen their vulnerability. And of course, we need to raise awareness on availability of financing opportunities, and as well enhance women's access to financial services. In tourism, women are mainly involved in activities of travel agencies, tour operators, reservations, and other tourism services, and they comprise 70% of this particular sphere of tourism. However, again, we see a salary gap, a significant one of around 37%. And also women are mainly engaged in clerical and administration work and are underrepresented in decision-making and leadership positions, which puts them at risk, and they cannot adapt well. And here we propose to create opportunities and promote women leadership in the sector, raise awareness and build adaptation capacity among private sector and general public, with a strong emphasis on women and the benefits of involving them more in the sector, develop sustainable financing mechanisms and making sure these are equally available to women. And there is awareness on women's side about this, because sometimes they are equally available. However, women have less knowledge of those and cannot benefit from them, and promote women's participation in adaptation planning and decision making. So that is for the three sectors that we have worked in. And it's just a very brief, because I don't have enough time to cover everything.
30 seconds, Gayane.
And I just wanted to say that we work a lot with government to promote women's role. Which is very important. We work with teachers here in Armenia to raise awareness on the role of women and the adaptation. And 97% of our participants are women, because they are mainly, our teachers are female. We work with journalists and media students on climate change and adaptation, raising awareness, making them our ambassadors to further raise awareness among the public and communicate correctly on climate change and adaptation and the needs and the roles of women and the vulnerability. And we promote participations of girls in climate change adaptation projects everywhere, in contests, all the events that we make, as well as women-led NGOs, because they are a great platform to further capitalize on that. And I just wanted to say that UNDP in Armenia has been involved in gender equality based activities for over 2 decades. And there are a number of completed projects, and there are still a number of projects that are being completed at the moment, and they work towards increasing women's involvement in politics, public administration, local democracy, economic sectors, and as well as boosting women innovators and making sure that we have more women involved in science and innovation. That is all from me. Thank you very much. Sorry if I took more time than 10 minutes.
That's right. Thank you, Gayane. Let's move ahead with our last presenter. But just a note for the panelists, if they see any questions raised in the Q&A box, please do answer. As it seems we're not going to have enough time to have that online. So Dr. Mira Haddad, Research Associate, Special Analysis and Data Management, International Center for Agricultural Research in the Dry Areas, ICARDA, based in Amman, Jordan. She has a vast experience in research related to the environment and management of resources, specialist in land, soil, and water management, as well as geographical and spatial data compilation. You have the floor.
I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
I would like first to thank you all for organizing and inviting ICARDA to present in this interesting webinar. I tried to minimize my slides and just to go quickly in the last minutes. Just to skip the introduction about Jordan food security and the related issues of how the current conditions in Jordan, I just kept this map just to show you how is Jordan agroclimatic zone is separated. It is mainly based on the amount of rainfall received. So we have a 3 agroclimatic zone. We have the Badia, we call it the Badia. I think it is a well-known term in the Middle East and I think in Egypt as well, where we receive less than 200 millimeter of rainfall. Then we have the rainfed areas, which is between 200 and I would say the higher values in Jordan is 500 millimeter average rainfall. And we have a small area, which we call it the basket of the food security in Jordan, which is the irrigated area in the Jordan Valley, which is a shared water resources between Jordan and the neighboring countries. Most of the water goes even to this irrigated area is coming from the upland area, which is the Badia or the rainfed ecosystem in Jordan. The community varies from the Badia moving to irrigated ecosystem. We can see Bedouin, people who depend very much on livestock. Then we can see trees, fruit trees, olive, especially in the rainfed system. Then we move downstream to irrigated ecosystem where we have vegetables and our tomato is well known to most of the Lebanese. Where does our water goes in Jordan? Most of it goes into evaporation or it goes into runoff. But this runoff happening in the Badia ends in the city. Flooding, we have extreme runoff. And I think my colleagues also from today, they mentioned a lot about flash flood and its impact on the cities. Moreover, we have also sand and dust storms occur in this Badia area. By the way, I forget to mention that from the image you saw, the map, that the Badia present around 90% of the country area. ICARDA did with SIAT, it's a sister center also in the 1CG. We did climate smart agriculture action plan for Jordan. And I just put some of the results of our study that the projected changes in the annual mean temperature and annual precipitation in Jordan is expected to change dramatically, especially if you can see that precipitation in most areas, we have less precipitation in the whole country, and we have more, we have increase in the temperature at the country scale. I left this slide just to show you what is our findings within this report. I put some numbers here just because I don't want to be repeated to the colleagues today. Women are most strongly representative among casual laborers who dedicated less than 4 months annually to agriculture. Less than 1% of total agricultural workers nationwide and about 2.3% of rural agriculture. They are often charged with post-harvest and value chain activities such as sorting, grading, and bagging cereals, as well as producing cheese, yogurt, and butter. Rural women often engaged in unpaid agricultural work, and this is unfortunately happening in all agroecological zones. I wanted also to show you that among a long list of the climate smart agriculture practices that our project try to list, we have only at the end of our study, we have selected 2 CSA practices in the according to the agri-ecological zones. And it seems women's role is highly can be seen in the ones in the Badia, enhanced small ruminant production and Badia restoration with micro water harvesting. I would say that there is within these 2 CSA practices, there is opportunities for women to be trained and to be increase their capacity and also develop appropriate local structure cooperative group, improve small ruminant production, improve the efficiency of the dairy production chain. And with the Badia restoration with micro water harvesting and improved grazing management, I also wanted to share with you another project that we implement in Jordan of restoration of degraded rangeland ecosystem. We basically restore and enhance dry ecosystem resilience and productivity, which has a lot of ecosystem services benefit. And we also manage resources through integrated approach. So we consider upstream and downstream approach. I'm sorry, I'm going quickly because we skipped the time. So basically we selected a watershed. And in this watershed, we implemented different sustainable land management practices with community involvement. I am not allowed in Jordan to post pictures for Bedouin women, but I tried to put pictures with community involvement here. For example, community were involved in the site selection processes, seed transportation and outplanting. This is also was men leading process. We also work with community and increase their awareness at school, at women groups, and also give training for youth, people, and so on. The support in the field, in the Badia, it comes from men, not from women, I would say. This is from our experience, like local community and youth, they are helping us in monitoring the site and collecting biophysical data, which we use as, we are a research center, which we use for our research and findings. After, let's say, 3 years of restoration, this is to compare how our site compared to the degraded phase, which is widely spread now. So the restoration provided improved ecosystem services, increased plant cover condition, and all of this improvement will support women at the end, because women are more women in the Badia responsibility is grazing, livestock caring and dairy production. So this is basically, I tried to link the CSA action plan of Jordan with projects that we implement in Jordan. I hope I was not so quick and deliver some message.
Thank you, Dr. Haddad. But let me also extend our thanks on behalf of the organizers of the AGBU and the Arab Institute for Women for all the panelists. Special thanks also go to Ricard at the end. I don't see much questions. What I would suggest is, because we did run out of time, we're over time 5 minutes actually. If that is okay, we can conclude this meeting and hope to see you all soon in person. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you very much. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you. And thank you, Aline and Liana. Really. Partners in crime.